Before we begin, take a deep breath and look around you. Every person you've ever trusted hides a secret pact inside their mind. Even you. What you're about to hear may awaken something that was never meant to be remembered. If you believe in the power of the unconscious, subscribe now and leave a comment below. Tell me what truth you've seen in yourself after watching. Because once this begins, there's no turning back. They say that most betrayals do not begin with hatred, but with a whisper inside love. Every war once began as an alliance. Every murderer once held a friend's hand. And every unconscious mind hides a silent contract, a pact formed not in words, but in shadows. It begins subtly, like a fog settling between two souls. You feel warmth, recognition, trust. The mind relaxes its guard, believing it has found safety. But beneath that safety lies something older, something that watches from behind the curtain of affection. A primitive intelligence that measures, envies, mirrors. It doesn't seek friendship, it seeks reflection. Because every friend, deep down, is a mirror. And every mirror eventually cracks. Carl Jung once wrote that no encounter between human beings is ever innocent. Each relationship awakens a fragment of the unconscious, the unspoken parts of ourselves we cannot bear to face alone. When two people meet, their shadows bow before their faces do. The darker the bond, the more complete the reflection. And this is how the unconscious pact begins. One person becomes the vessel for what the other refuses to acknowledge. You love them because they hold your light, but also your darkness. They love you because you make their demons feel seen. Neither of you realize what is happening. You believe it's friendship, but the soul knows otherwise. Take the case of Franz K., one a patient Jung once described in private notes. A scholar, calm and rational, who devoted his life to one trusted companion, Ernst. Their bond was deep, the kind that forms in silence more than in words. But over years, subtle shifts began to poison the air between them. Franz could not explain why Ernst's laughter felt sharper, or why he himself felt uneasy in moments of joy. One evening, during an argument over nothing, Franz found himself shouting words he didn't recognize, words that came from a deeper voice. You want me dead so you can live. The next day, Ernst left without a trace. Months later, Franz received a letter. I cannot stand seeing in you what I most despise in myself. When Jung heard the story, he called it a psychic mirroring collapse. The friendship had not ended because of a disagreement, but because the unconscious pact between them had reached its breaking point. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung saw in his dreams. Mirror neurons, empathy circuits, and emotional contagion are not spiritual poetry. They are biological conspiracies. When we bond, our brains synchronize their rhythms. Our fears, desires, and judgments leak into each other through subtle signals: tone, breath, posture. Over time, the boundary between you and me dissolves. At first, this merging feels divine, but then comes the infection. When one of the minds represses something, jealousy, guilt, fear, it does not vanish. It is projected. And the other person becomes its host. Science calls it emotional transference. Jung called it possession. The ancients knew this long before psychology existed. In Greek myth, the story of Orestes and Pylades was celebrated as perfect friendship, two souls inseparable even in death. Yet behind that myth lies a darker truth. Orestes carried the curse of matricide, and Pylades carried it with him. The gods demanded one of them to die so the curse could end. The pact was sacred and deadly. In Buddhism, the concept of karmic bonds explains similar entanglements, two beings tied not by choice, but by unresolved shadows from previous incarnations. Love turns into debt, compassion into pain. The thread cannot be cut by reason alone. It requires awakening. The signs are always there, but we rarely see them. You begin to think of your friend when they are not present. You feel their moods without speaking. You start apologizing for things you didn't do. Then, one day, you notice the silence. A silence that no longer feels peaceful. It feels like being watched from inside. That is the first sign of the pact becoming conscious. The unconscious, sensing danger, begins to surface. Dreams turn violent. Memories rewrite themselves. The friend you once trusted begins to carry the weight of everything you've denied. They irritate you without cause. They remind you of what you wanted to forget. And finally, the rupture comes. Not through conflict, but through awakening. One of you sees the truth, that your friendship was built upon projection, not reality. The mirror shatters, and with it, the illusion of innocence. This transformation follows a predictable path. First, fascination, a magnetic pull toward the one who seems to understand you completely. Then, identification, the merging of ideals and fears. Next, dependency, when your sense of self begins to orbit around the other. And finally, reversal, when the unconscious balance collapses and the light turns to darkness. In that moment, the mind seeks survival through rejection. The once beloved face becomes unbearable because it reflects what must be destroyed within. And so, the friend becomes the enemy, not out of malice, but necessity. Jung called it the enantiodromia, the running of opposites. Every psychological force, when pushed to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. Love becomes hatred. Loyalty becomes revenge. The unconscious demands balance, and if denied, it enforces it through destruction. That is the essence of the mortal pact. It binds two souls together until one must die, metaphorically or otherwise, so that the other may live free of its projection. You might think this is rare, a pathology for the disturbed, but look closer. In workplaces, families, movements, even spiritual groups, everywhere the same invisible web appears. People drawn together by shared ideals, only to destroy each other once those ideals reveal their hidden costs. The unconscious pact thrives wherever truth is denied. It feeds on silence, politeness, and fear of confrontation. It grows in the spaces where we say, "I'm fine," instead of, "I feel betrayed." It matures in the darkness between words. If you wish to recognize it before it consumes you, remember this law. Whenever you feel both deeply connected and strangely drained by someone, you are already within the pact. The energy you sense is not love, it is exchange. Something in you is being fed, and something in you is being eaten. Awareness is the only antidote, not distance, not denial. You must look into the mirror without flinching and see what part of you the other has been carrying. Forgive them, not because they deserve it, but because it frees you from the reflection. Break the pact by reclaiming what is yours. Name the shadow. Withdraw the projection. Stand alone in the silence that follows, and you will feel the echo of freedom, a loneliness that no longer wounds, but purifies. For only when the pact is broken can friendship become real. Until then, every smile hides an ancient fear, and every handshake is a silent agreement with the abyss. Betrayal is never born in the moment it explodes. It begins long before the act, quietly, invisibly, in the dark corridors of the psyche. The knife in the back is only the final signature of a contract written in dreams, fears, and silent envy. Every betrayal is an unconscious ritual, a sacred act of the shadow reclaiming what the ego refused to acknowledge. In the beginning, there's fascination. The friend becomes the mirror of everything you admire, everything you long to be. You feel safe because they seem to see you, to understand the parts of you the world ignored. But this safety is deceptive. Jung described it as participation mystique, a psychological fusion where individuality dissolves and two souls begin to share a single unconscious. The moment that fusion occurs, the clock of betrayal starts ticking. Because the unconscious does not tolerate symmetry for long, it seeks balance through opposition, creation through destruction. The same energy that binds two people together begins to polarize them. You start to notice details you never saw before, the way they interrupt you, the way they look away during your triumphs. Tiny cracks appear in the glass of affection, but these are not flaws in them, they are projections returning home. What you see as betrayal is, in truth, the reflection of your own hidden resentment. You envy their freedom. They envy your light. The mind begins to rewrite history. They never really cared. I was just being used. What you call revelation is often your own shadow finally speaking through you. Neuroscience describes this shift as the collapse of oxytocin bonding. The very hormone that once generated trust begins to amplify suspicion when the bond is threatened. The brain, addicted to safety, interprets any deviation as danger. Betrayal, therefore, is not a choice. It is a neuropsychological eruption of broken mirroring. When the self feels unseen, it attacks the one who used to see it. It's the brain's way of saying, "I must destroy you to preserve the illusion of who I am." In one of Jung's most disturbing case notes, he wrote about a woman who adored her mentor to the point of worship. She imitated his speech, his gestures, even his handwriting. When he withdrew emotionally, she began to dream of his death. In those dreams, she would stab him only to awaken in tears, whispering, "Why does love hurt like this?" Jung concluded that her unconscious could no longer sustain the imbalance. The idealized image of the mentor had absorbed her individuality. To reclaim her identity, her psyche had to symbolically kill him. Betrayal, then, was not hatred, it was resurrection. This pattern echoes across history. In myth, Judas is remembered as the betrayer of Christ, yet his act was necessary for the prophecy to unfold. Jung often suggested that Judas was not evil but possessed by the archetype of the betrayer, a force that manifests whenever transformation demands sacrifice. Betrayal is the crucifixion of illusion. It destroys the false union so the soul can emerge as itself. That is why every betrayal feels sacred and profane at once. Science, too, has begun to uncover this paradox. Studies in cognitive dissonance and attachment trauma reveal that the brain cannot tolerate long-term contradictions between love and fear. When someone we depend on becomes the source of our pain, our neural networks split into opposing patterns, one devoted to affection, the other to protection. The mind cannot serve two masters. Eventually, it chooses survival. And in choosing survival, it must rewrite the narrative. They are the enemy. Betrayal becomes the unconscious solution to restore psychological coherence. The ancients understood this under different names. The Gnostics spoke of syzygy, twin forces that exist only through conflict. In Taoism, yin and yang forever chase one another in an eternal dance of inversion. Love and hatred are not opposites. They are two sides of one current, flowing through the same channel of desire. What we call betrayal is simply the turning of that current when the vessel overflows. You can recognize the signs long before the act if you dare to look. It begins with subtle withdrawal, delayed replies, forced smiles, eyes that do not meet yours. Then come small betrayals of thought, secrets justified as protection, omissions disguised as mercy. The air thickens with unspoken judgments. You feel a chill during laughter, a sense that the warmth has been replaced by performance. In those moments, the unconscious pact is shifting. The mind that once mirrored you now begins to invert you. You become their projection of guilt, their vessel for unresolved pain. The stages unfold like a ritual: idealization, doubt, resentment, justification, execution, and aftermath. Each stage follows the logic of transformation. Idealization binds you, doubt cracks the illusion, resentment fuels the inversion, justification grants moral permission, execution fulfills the psychic command. And aftermath, the silence that follows, is the void where a new self must be born. Most people stop there, broken, blaming. But those who dare to look deeper discover the true purpose of the wound, to reveal what part of themselves they had handed away in trust. Modern psychotherapists describe this as reintegrating the shadow projection. You must retrieve the fragments you projected onto others, your need to be seen, your fear of rejection, your hunger for validation. Only then can the betrayal lose its poison. Jung warned that if you do not reclaim your shadow, the world will play it out for you through tragedy. Every unintegrated emotion will find a body to inhabit. Every denied truth will choose a face to wear. The final cruelty is that betrayal is not only interpersonal, it is internal. The friend who deceived you is often the reflection of your own divided psyche. Part of you longs for loyalty, another part longs for freedom. The conflict is ancient, written in the architecture of consciousness itself. Betrayal is the eruption of the suppressed God within you demanding worship. It whispers, "You built your world on illusions. Now watch it fall." So when love turns to destruction, do not ask, "Why did they betray me?" Ask instead, "What truth in me demanded this fall?" Because only through the ashes of trust can self-awareness rise. The unconscious does not seek comfort, it seeks wholeness. And wholeness demands sacrifice, even of those we love most. In the mirror of betrayal, every soul stands alone, stripped of its projections, trembling before its true image. That is the moment Jung called individuation, the death of illusion and the birth of the real self. But most turn away. They prefer to keep the lie alive than to face the abyss of authenticity. To those few who dare, betrayal becomes not an ending, but initiation. The friend who turned into an enemy was merely the hand of fate, pulling you toward yourself. For the unconscious always fulfills its promise, even when it must destroy your world to do so. There is a reason the mind invents enemies, even when none exist. The soul, in its hunger for wholeness, constructs opposition as an instrument of evolution. The friend who turns against you, the stranger who despises you without cause, the loved one whose eyes suddenly turn cold, they are not random figures in your story. They are projections of your internal architecture, manifestations of a truth too unbearable to face directly. The psyche externalizes what it cannot integrate. The enemy, therefore, is not born from hatred, but from disowned love. Carl Jung warned that the shadow is not a monster lurking in the dark, but the very foundation of individuality. It is everything we are, but refuse to see, every desire repressed, every fear denied, every impulse judged unworthy. When the conscious mind insists on purity, the unconscious compensates with darkness. That compensation takes form, sometimes as dreams, sometimes as illness, and sometimes as another person. The enemy you meet outside is the messenger of your inner split. In the collective unconscious, this mechanism has existed since the dawn of myth. Humanity has always needed villains to maintain its sense of virtue. Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus, Lucifer and Michael, twin forces birthed from a single divine source. One carries the light, the other carries the denied truth. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the turning of one pole into its opposite. When love is suppressed, hatred emerges to restore the balance. When perfection is worshipped, corruption must rise to destroy it. Modern neuroscience, with all its instruments and scans, has begun to reveal this same paradox. Brain imaging studies show that regions responsible for moral judgment and aggression often overlap. The same circuits that generate empathy can also generate contempt when the self-image is threatened. The neural mirror turns inward and becomes a weapon. What we call evil is often self-defense at the level of identity. To preserve who we think we are, the mind must cast out what does not fit. It builds enemies the way a city builds walls, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of invasion. Jung once told the story of a respected theologian tormented by visions of demons, whispering obscene words during prayer. He begged Jung to exorcise them. Instead, Jung said, "Listen." The man wept, terrified but obeyed. After weeks of listening, he realized the voices were not demonic at all. They were his own suppressed doubts about God, his repressed lust, his anger at life. The demons were fragments of his humanity, exiled by moral perfection. Once he embraced them, the voices ceased. His enemy had been his own imprisoned truth. Ancient traditions echoed this wisdom long before psychology. In Tibetan Buddhism, practitioners meditate on wrathful deities, terrifying figures with fangs and flames, not to banish them, but to understand them. The wrathful gods are expressions of enlightened energy distorted by resistance. In Christianity, the Desert Fathers spoke of the noonday demon, the spirit of despair that attacks the devout when they repress their human desires. Even Plato, in his dialogues, warned that the soul must confront its inner tyrant before it can achieve harmony. Across ages and religions, the message is the same. The shadow ignored becomes the shadow that rules. But how does this architecture take form? It begins in childhood, when we learn what is acceptable and what is forbidden. A boy who cries too much learns to despise weakness. A girl who asserts herself learns to fear her own power. These disowned traits retreat into the unconscious, but they do not die. They gather energy, waiting for mirrors to reflect them. Later, those mirrors appear as friends, lovers, colleagues, each carrying a piece of what we buried. When we encounter them, we feel fascination or disgust. We call it chemistry or rivalry or destiny. In truth, it is recognition. The mind organizes these projections into archetypal roles: the betrayer, the savior, the rival, the persecutor. Each role is a container for psychic energy. The stronger the repression, the more powerful the projection. That is why our enemies seem larger than life. They are charged with our own disowned vitality. We hate them not for what they are, but for what they awaken in us. The friend who criticizes you embodies your self-doubt. The lover who leaves you carries your fear of abandonment. The colleague who outshines you mirrors your own buried ambition. You cannot escape them because they are structural, part of the architecture of your becoming. Science calls this the attribution error, the human tendency to explain others' behavior by character while excusing our own as circumstance. Yet beneath this bias lies something sacred. The psyche uses projection as communication. It sends us enemies not to punish us, but to teach us what we have refused to see. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But few ever reach that understanding. Most kill the messenger instead." To dismantle this architecture, one must perform a psychological descent, a journey Jung called the night sea voyage. It requires the courage to face the creatures that swim in your depths. You must ask yourself uncomfortable questions. Why does this person disturb me so deeply? What in them feels familiar? What part of me seeks their destruction? In that interrogation lies liberation. For the moment you see the enemy as a projection, the spell breaks. You reclaim the energy that once bound you to hatred. Collectively, this mechanism explains humanity's endless cycles of conflict. Nations, religions, and ideologies are nothing more than collective egos defending themselves against collective shadows. Each group imagines its purity threatened by an external force, not realizing that the threat was born from within. The wars we fight outside mirror the wars we refuse to face inside. Every genocide, every persecution, every revolution is the unconscious architecture of a species afraid of its own reflection. But awareness changes everything. When you recognize that your enemies are architects of your wholeness, you stop feeding them with hatred. You begin to see that their existence is not accidental but essential. They are the sculptors of your inner cathedral, carving depth where complacency once ruled. The soul creates opposition because peace without tension is stagnation. Light needs darkness to know itself. In the end, the architecture of the shadow is divine in design but deadly in ignorance. Those who worship their own light will always drown in their darkness. Those who confront their darkness will discover a light no one can steal. The enemy outside is the unfinished part of your soul calling for completion. Ignore it, and it becomes your destroyer. Face it, and it becomes your teacher. The world is full of enemies only because the human mind is full of unfinished selves. When the architecture collapses, what remains is not destruction, but revelation. For the greatest secret Jung ever revealed was this: the shadow is not against you. It is you, waiting to be known. Possession does not require demons, it only requires repression. The moment you deny a truth within yourself, that truth begins to move independently, a wandering fragment of psyche seeking a voice, a face, a body. When it finds none, it possesses yours. Jung called this phenomenon psychic possession, and he saw it everywhere. In lovers consumed by jealousy, in leaders intoxicated by righteousness, in entire nations marching in trance. The possessed never know they are possessed. They believe they have found their purpose, when in fact, purpose has found them and devoured them. It begins innocently. You suppress anger to be kind. You hide envy to appear noble. You silence fear to seem strong. But the unconscious does not obey appearances. Every feeling you bury becomes a living entity in the dark, gathering resentment against its imprisonment. Over time, it begins to whisper through dreams, moods, slips of the tongue. The repressed voice grows louder until it hijacks your behavior. You say things you never meant, do things you swore you wouldn't, hurt those you love most. Then, afterward, you say, "I don't know what came over me." Jung's answer was chilling, something that was always there, waiting for you to fall asleep. Science has begun to touch this mystery through the study of dissociation and emotional contagion. Neuroimaging reveals that strong emotional suppression activates the amygdala, the brain's threat center, as if you were under attack. The more you repress, the more your nervous system prepares for war against yourself. Under prolonged tension, the prefrontal cortex, which governs reasoning, weakens. The unconscious, no longer held in check, floods perception. The person becomes reactive, impulsive, driven by symbols instead of facts. Possession, from a neuroscientific lens, is the triumph of the limbic over the logical, the return of the ancient animal mind to the throne of consciousness. Jung once recounted the case of a man whose politeness was legendary. He smiled even when insulted, helped even when exploited, but in his dreams he saw himself strangling strangers. "I could never do such a thing," he said. Months later, during a minor argument, he nearly killed a colleague with his bare hands. The eruption terrified him. Jung told him, "It was not the devil, it was your shadow, tired of your hypocrisy." That man spent years rebuilding his life, learning that kindness without boundaries is cruelty in disguise, cruelty toward the self that eventually spills outward. Every culture has named this process differently. The Greeks spoke of the daimonion, the inner voice that guides or destroys. In Christianity, possession was blamed on Satan, but exorcism often revealed what Jung would call split consciousness, the victim speaking with the voice of their denied emotion. In African and Caribbean traditions, spirits ride the living, embodying ancestral forces of rage or protection. Though symbols differ, the core remains identical. When consciousness refuses dialogue with the unconscious seizes control. But possession is not always violent. Sometimes it wears a smile. It appears as moral certainty, as obsession with justice, as spiritual superiority. You see it in the zealot who burns others to prove his purity, in the lover who stalks under the name of devotion, and the politician who destroys nations in the name of salvation. Each believes they act freely. In truth, they are marionettes of their own unlived life. The shadow has found expression, not through integration, but domination. In the modern world, digital life has become a stage for possession. Algorithms amplify outrage, fear, and envy, the perfect food for the collective shadow. Online, people speak with voices that do not feel their own, consumed by movements, ideologies, and hatreds they barely understand. Jung foresaw this, warning that mass identification leads to psychic infection. The larger the crowd, he wrote, the smaller the individual soul. The unconscious, once personal, becomes collective. Possession scales from the mind to the masses. The signs are subtle but unmistakable. You stop listening. Every opposing idea feels like an attack. You no longer question your righteousness. You surround yourself with reflections of your belief, and any dissent becomes heresy. Then the final stage arrives, dehumanization. You no longer see others as beings, but as symbols of what you must destroy. That is when possession completes itself. The ego, starved of humility, merges with the archetype of the avenger, the purifier, the victim, whichever mask the unconscious has chosen for its theater. How does one resist this seduction? Jung's answer was both simple and terrifying. Awareness. To look directly at the impulses that frighten you without acting on them. To confess your hatred without justification, your envy without shame, your fear without disguise. Awareness disarms possession because it dissolves denial. The shadow can influence only what remains unseen. When you name it, it loses its autonomy. This is not suppression, it is dialogue. The ego must speak with its monsters, for silence is their kingdom. Spiritual traditions echo this wisdom. The Buddhists call it mindfulness, the watcher behind the storm. The Stoics called it reason in alignment with nature. Christ called it vigilance against temptation. In all languages, it means the same. Remember yourself. The possessed forget. They become the emotion. The conscious remembers, and by remembering, they remain free. Yet freedom is not without cost. To confront the shadow is to accept guilt, limitation, imperfection. You must renounce the comfort of innocence. The possessed seek purity. The awakened accept complexity. Only those who can endure the tension of opposites, light and dark, good and evil, love and rage, can avoid being swallowed by either. Jung compared this to walking on the edge of a sword. Every step bleeds, but every step is real. Possession is not the work of demons. It is the refusal to dialogue with divinity. For the divine speaks through both terror and tenderness. The voice that says, destroy, is the same that whispers, transform. To confuse them is fatal. To discern them is liberation. The true exorcism is not holy water, it is consciousness itself. And so the warning stands, those who preach only light will one day serve the dark. Those who deny their anger will become instruments of vengeance. Those who bury their desire will live as slaves to it. The unconscious waits patiently for its due. If you do not give it voice, it will take your tongue. If you do not give it form, it will take your life. This is the price of being human. To contain infinity within a fragile mind and to remain sane in the presence of gods that wear your face. Reality is not a solid ground. It is a mirror made of smoke, sustained by the fragile agreement between our senses and our beliefs. When the unconscious rises, that agreement shatters. The world bends, refracts, and rearranges itself around the hidden contents of the psyche. You begin to see patterns where none exist, hear meaning in silence, and interpret coincidence as fate. Jung called this psychic inflation the moment when the inner world invades the outer. The possessed mind no longer perceives reality, it manufactures it. This fracture often begins with emotion. Anger distorts time, fear magnifies threat, desire edits memory. Neuroscience confirms what mystics knew. Perception is not passive reception, but active construction. The brain filters and shapes experience through expectation. When the unconscious seizes control, those filters warp. The result is a private universe where every glance becomes a signal, every event a message. Delusion begins not with madness, but with meaning. Jung saw this often among patients undergoing deep analysis. One woman, tormented by loneliness, began to believe the birds outside her window sang only for her. At first, Jung interpreted it symbolically, the psyche seeking connection through projection. But soon, she could no longer distinguish song from summons. Her world had tilted. Jung wrote, "When the inner voice becomes too loud, the outer world becomes a mere echo." The unconscious had rewritten her perception to protect her from despair, offering illusion in place of isolation. Modern psychology describes this through the predictive coding model. The brain predicts reality, then updates its model through sensory evidence. But when trauma or repression disrupts this loop, the mind favors prediction over perception. You see what you need to see to preserve coherence. The result is psychosis in severe cases, but subtler fractures appear everywhere, in ideologies, conspiracies, and personal narratives that refuse contradiction. Humanity lives constantly on the brink of psychosis, held together by collective stories. Every culture has tried to stabilize this tension through myth. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul must pass through the underworld to reclaim balance between chaos and order. In Hindu cosmology, Shiva destroys illusion so Brahma may create again. These are not tales of distant gods. They are metaphors for psychic equilibrium. When consciousness clings too tightly to its constructed world, the unconscious must intervene as chaos. That chaos is not punishment, but renewal. The fracture is the crack through which truth enters. But the danger is immense. Once the world begins to mirror your psyche, it becomes impossible to tell whether the betrayal came from outside or from within. The friend who suddenly turned against you might merely be acting out your own unacknowledged aggression. The lover's rejection might be the externalization of your self-loathing. Jung called this synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence that bridges inner and outer events. When the boundary between mind and matter dissolves, fate begins to speak in symbols. To the unprepared, this experience feels divine at first. The world seems alive with significance. Numbers repeat, dreams foreshadow reality, strangers utter your secret thoughts. You feel chosen, guided, awakened. But beneath this ecstasy lies a perilous trap. The psyche, intoxicated with meaning, begins to feed on its own creations. Everything becomes personal. The collective world disappears. Paranoia replaces perception. In this state, relationships disintegrate. Societies polarize, and truth becomes relative. Everyone becomes the protagonist of their private apocalypse. Science observes this on a global scale. Cognitive dissonance studies show that when beliefs are threatened, the brain doubles down, not out of logic, but identity preservation. Social media amplifies this, surrounding individuals with mirrors of confirmation. The unconscious, once buried, now manifests collectively through digital hallucination. Millions sharing the same dream, insisting it is reality. Jung foresaw this emergence of psychic epidemics, warning that the next great threat to humanity would not be war or disease, but possession by ideas. He was right. Entire groups now behave as if reality itself were negotiable. Facts no longer matter, only narrative survives. The world fractures into parallel truths, each sustained by emotion rather than evidence. From a psychological lens, these are not political divisions, but archetypal possessions. Each side projects its shadow onto the other. We are pure, they are corrupted. We are victims, they are monsters. The collective unconscious feeds on conflict because conflict keeps the illusion of moral order alive. In private lives, the fracture is quieter but equally devastating. A person betrayed by love begins to believe that everyone is deceitful. A child neglected by a parent grows into an adult convinced that affection always hides manipulation. The psyche generalizes its wound into worldview. This is how trauma becomes cosmology. The external world conforms to the architecture of pain, and reality becomes a prison built from memory. Jung called this the concretization of the complex, the moment when an emotional knot crystallizes into fact. But there is a way through the fracture. Jung taught that integration begins when you realize that reality is not broken. Perception is. The task is not to repair the world, but to expand the self. to see contradiction without collapsing, to hold paradox without panic. This requires a radical humility, the acceptance that your experience is symbolic, not absolute. The unconscious does not lie. It speaks in metaphor. The world it builds around you is not punishment, but communication. Each distortion is a message from the depths, demanding interpretation. Spiritual traditions agree. The mystic's dark night of the soul is not delusion, but deconstruction, the stripping away of comforting illusions until the raw structure of being remains. The Buddhist calls this emptiness, the Christian calls it purification, the alchemist calls it nigredo, the blackening before rebirth. All describe the same process, the death of the false world so the real can emerge. Yet few endure it willingly. Most flee back to certainty, clinging to whatever belief restores order. But those who stay in the fracture discover something terrifying and beautiful, that reality itself is consciousness unfolding. The mind does not live inside the world, the world lives inside the mind. When you understand this, you stop demanding that others see what you see. You cease to argue with mirrors. You begin to walk through illusion with compassion, aware that every distortion hides a wound. The fracture of reality is not the end of sanity, it is its beginning. For only by breaking the glass of perception can the soul escape its reflection. The unconscious rewrites the world not to deceive you, but to wake you, to show that truth is not found in what is seen, but in who is seeing. Those who survive the fracture become witnesses of both worlds, the visible and the invisible. They learn to navigate between them like dreamwalkers, never fully belonging to either, and when they speak, their words carry the weight of revelation. That reality is not a place, but a mirror of the soul. Every human being is born carrying ghosts. You inherit them not through blood alone, but through silence, the unspoken memories of those who came before you. The sins your ancestors refused to confess become the burdens you cannot explain. Jung called this the ancestral shadow, the transgenerational transmission of unresolved psychic content. It is the hidden DNA of trauma, shaping destinies long before consciousness awakens. The family you were born into is not merely a social structure. It is a living archive of the collective unconscious, repeating patterns until someone dares to remember. The first symptom of this inheritance is repetition. You find yourself reliving conflicts you swore to escape, marrying your father's anger, becoming your mother's silence, reenacting the betrayals you witnessed as a child. You call it fate or bad luck, but it is memory, cellular, invisible, relentless. Neuroscience has confirmed that trauma alters gene expression through epigenetics, marking descendants with biochemical echoes of fear and grief. What the soul calls curse, biology calls adaptation. Both are correct. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Jung once wrote about a young man tormented by guilt for crimes he never committed. He dreamed of soldiers burning villages, of screams that haunted him upon waking. During analysis, he discovered that his grandfather had been a military officer responsible for atrocities. The grandson's psyche had inherited the grandfather's denied remorse. Jung concluded, "The dead do not rest until the living remember." The unconscious demands balance not only within an individual, but within the lineage. What is repressed by one generation will surface in the next, disguised as destiny. Ancient cultures understood this instinctively. In African and indigenous traditions, ancestors are not metaphors, but presences. When neglected, they disturb the living through illness and misfortune. In Greek myth, the Erinyes, the Furies, pursued families who concealed blood guilt, ensuring justice across generations. In Christianity, the concept of original sin carries similar resonance, humanity bearing the imprint of a primal transgression. Each story encodes the same law. The psyche seeks equilibrium across time. The shadow never dies, it migrates. The signs of ancestral possession are subtle yet precise. You feel emotions that do not belong to your story, sudden waves of despair, unexplainable guilt, terror without cause. You inherit not only eye color and bone structure, but patterns of thought and emotional reflexes. A family that survives through submission produces children afraid of conflict. A lineage built on conquest breeds descendants who cannot rest without domination. Each generation oscillates between compensating for and replicating the sins of the previous. The pendulum becomes identity. Modern psychology calls this intergenerational trauma, but Jung would argue it is deeper than psychology. It is metaphysical. The unconscious is timeless. It stores not only personal memories, but archetypal experiences. When you dream of wars you never fought, you are touching the strata of humanity's collective suffering. In this sense, every person is both victim and perpetrator, carrier and redeemer. You are the latest mask through which history seeks resolution. Consider the phenomenon of family secrets. A child grows up sensing tension, but never hearing the story. We don't talk about that, the elders say. Yet silence does not erase. It embeds. The forbidden truth seeps into behavior, shaping dynamics without language. Jung compared this to radioactive material buried in the earth, unseen but lethal. The only antidote is consciousness. To uncover the secret is to stop the transmission. But most families protect their ghosts. They fear that speaking will awaken the curse, not realizing that silence feeds it. The process of liberation begins with confrontation. The analyst, the mystic, the truth seeker, each becomes an archaeologist of the soul, digging through generations of denial. The goal is not to accuse, but to integrate. Jung wrote that healing occurs when we take responsibility for the darkness we did not create, but continue to perpetuate. The moment you say, "This ends with me," you interrupt the ancestral pattern. The ghosts lose their script. Science echoes this truth in unexpected ways. Studies on epigenetic therapy suggest that new experiences, love, safety, meaning, can reverse stress imprints passed down through DNA. In other words, consciousness changes biology. Awareness reprograms inheritance. This convergence of psychology and genetics reveals what mystics have long claimed. The soul can rewrite the flesh. But awareness alone is not enough. You must perform a symbolic act of remembrance. Ritual, confession, or creation. The unconscious understands gesture more than words. Light a candle for the forgotten. Write the story that was silenced. Speak the name no one dared to utter. These acts transform guilt into gratitude, pain into lineage, curse into continuity. The ancestors are not enemies, they are unfinished beings seeking completion through you. In alchemical terms, this process is transmutatio, the conversion of lead into gold, suffering into wisdom. Each shadow integrated adds weight to your soul until it becomes luminous. Jung believed that the individual who heals his family trauma performs a sacred task for humanity. For the personal unconscious is the gateway to the collective. The microcosm heals the macrocosm. When one person awakens, the chain of blindness weakens across centuries. Yet the danger remains. To identify too deeply with ancestral pain is to become possessed by it. The goal is not to drown in history, but to bring it to light. You are not the wound, you are its witness. Awareness must stand firm against the seduction of victimhood. For the shadow does not seek pity, it seeks recognition. If you listen closely, the whispers of your lineage will shift from curses to counsel. They will no longer say, "Suffer as we did," but "Finish what we began." That is the transformation of inheritance into destiny. The ghosts no longer haunt, they guide. The inheritance of darkness is not a sentence, but a summons. You were chosen by your bloodline to confront what others feared, to bring consciousness where silence ruled. The weight you carry is ancient, but it is also sacred. To bear it consciously is to redeem not only yourself, but the forgotten dead. In the end, perhaps that is the true meaning of salvation, not escape from sin, but integration of history. The soul, after all, is not born new. It is born remembering. There are moments in history when humanity behaves as one organism. Minds synchronize, hearts beat in unison, and entire nations dream the same dream. It feels like unity, like progress, like destiny. But beneath that ecstasy lurks something far older and darker. Jung called it the collective possession, a psychic infection that spreads not through air or blood, but through meaning. When individuals abandon reflection for belonging, the unconscious seizes the stage. The crowd becomes the shadow made flesh. Every civilization carries a collective ego, the myth it tells itself to justify its existence. We are chosen. We are free. We are righteous. These myths bind people together, but they also demand enemies to remain coherent. Without opposition, identity dissolves. Thus, societies unconsciously create what Jung called shadow nations, groups or ideologies onto which they project their denied impulses. The society that worships peace breeds unseen violence. The culture obsessed with purity hides corruption at its core. The collective mirror reflects not who a nation claims to be, but what it refuses to face. The 20th century offered horrifying evidence of this dynamic. Jung, watching Europe descend into totalitarian madness, wrote that Hitler was not merely a man, but an archetype, a mouthpiece of the collective unconscious. The German people, humiliated and repressed, projected their wounded self-image onto him. He became both savior and destroyer, embodying their collective rage. The same pattern reappears in every age, wearing new masks, revolutions that devour their children, religions that burn heretics, corporations that exploit under the banner of progress. The symbols change, the structure endures. Modern neuroscience has traced this contagion to the brain's mirror system, the neural circuits that make emotions contagious. Group identity activates reward centers. Belonging feels like survival. When the tribe is threatened, empathy narrows, and cruelty becomes virtue. The mind justifies atrocities in the name of collective good. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. Jung would call it possession by the archetype of the hero, the savior, the avenger. The individual dissolves into the role assigned by history. In the digital age, this process has accelerated beyond Jung's imagination. Social networks function as amplifiers of archetypes. Every outrage, every virtue, every hatred replicated at light speed. The collective unconscious has found a nervous system. Memes become myths, influencers become priests. People no longer think, they echo. The global mind dreams in algorithms, each pulse a neuron firing in the machinery of mass emotion. Jung warned that The gods have become diseases. Today, they have become trends. Ancient traditions foresaw this danger. In Hindu cosmology, the current era is called Kali Yuga, the age of confusion, when truth and falsehood intertwine and humans worship their own reflection. In Christianity, the Antichrist is not a person, but a consciousness that inverts values, calling evil good and good evil. Plato's allegory of the cave predicted the same, a society content with shadows, mistaking images for reality. Each prophecy points to the same phenomenon, the collective mirror replacing the world. The symptoms are unmistakable. Polarization intensifies. Dialogue dies. Empathy collapses. Facts lose meaning. The air grows thick with hysteria. People speak in absolutes, unable to tolerate ambiguity. When the unconscious rules, everything becomes symbolic. Every headline, every gesture, every word charged with mythic significance. The collective shadow no longer hides in dreams. It tweets, votes, and buys. The world becomes theater, and the audience forgets it is watching itself. You can observe this possession in miniature within any group dynamic. Families, workplaces, movements, each develops its own psychic climate. When one member voices dissent, the others close ranks, defending the myth of harmony. The heretic becomes the scapegoat. This mechanism is as old as religion. The tribe projects its guilt onto one body and expels it, believing purification has been achieved. But the shadow does not leave. It simply changes shape. Every canceled person, every witch burned, every exile created by consensus is proof of collective cowardice disguised as virtue. Science, again, corroborates the spiritual. Studies in social psychology show that groups experience de-individuation, a loss of self-awareness, when anonymity and emotion combine. Brain scans reveal reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment. In crowds, we regress to the primal mind. Civilization becomes ritual. Violence becomes trance. The collective shadow dances. And yet, not all is doom. Within every psychic epidemic lies a seed of awakening. Jung believed that the suffering of the masses forces consciousness to evolve. When the old myths collapse under their own hypocrisy, individuals begin to think again. The dissenter, the artist, the mystic, these are antibodies of the collective soul. They restore dialogue where dogma ruled. They break the spell by remembering the self. To resist the collective mirror, one must endure solitude. You must withdraw your reflection from the mob, even when it costs you belonging. This is the true rebellion, to remain conscious while others sleep. Jung called this individuation, the sacred act of remembering one's divine autonomy amid chaos. It is not arrogance, it is survival. The collective will always demand sacrifice, of doubt, of complexity, of conscience. The awakened refuse. They carry their loneliness as armor, knowing that truth cannot be shared by crowds, only witnessed by individuals. Spiritual traditions teach the same in gentler language. Christ withdrew to the desert. Buddha sat beneath the tree. Every prophet, every visionary, every rebel against mass delusion first confronted isolation. For only in silence can you hear the whisper that says, "The world you see is your shadow magnified." When enough individuals awaken, the collective begins to heal. Consciousness spreads like dawn, not by conquest, but by contagion of clarity. In the end, societies fall not because they sin, but because they dream too long without waking. The collective mirror, polished by fear and desire, reflects a beauty that blinds. When it shatters, as it always does, the survivors stand among the shards and finally see themselves. Jung believed that humanity's salvation lies in this shattering. For when the mirror breaks, the reflection disappears, and what remains is reality, fragile, imperfect, alive. That is when civilization begins anew, not as an empire of illusions, but as a gathering of souls who remember what it means to be human. Betrayal is not merely a personal wound, it is a sacred ritual, enacted across the architecture of the psyche. Since the beginning of human memory, every myth, every scripture, every tragedy revolves around the same act, the moment when love turns against itself. Judas and Christ, Brutus and Caesar, Oedipus and his father. The betrayer and the betrayed are not opposites. They are two sides of the same soul, divided by necessity. Jung understood this better than anyone. The shadow does not only hide darkness, it demands offering. The unconscious insists on equilibrium, and equilibrium requires sacrifice. To understand betrayal, one must abandon morality and enter myth. The ego dreams of stability, but the soul seeks transformation. And transformation always begins with rupture. When two people form a bond, they create a psychic field, an invisible organism that feeds on both their energies. Over time, that organism grows stronger than either individual. It hungers for renewal. The betrayal is its feast. It consumes the illusion of permanence to keep life moving forward. That is why betrayal feels both horrifying and fated. It is the unconscious tearing down the old temple so a new self can emerge from the ruins. Jung once described a woman who worshipped her husband as a saint. For 20 years, she sacrificed her desires to preserve their marriage. When she discovered his infidelity, her world collapsed. Yet in her despair, she felt something awakening. "It's strange," she told Jung. "I finally feel alive." The betrayal had killed the false god she had built from devotion. Her rage became resurrection. Jung wrote that betrayal, though devastating, serves the individuation process when endured consciously. It forces the personality to face its idolatry, the worship of another as the vessel of one's own unlived life. Modern psychology echoes this. Studies on attachment reveal that the deepest trauma of betrayal occurs not because of the loss of another, but because of the collapse of identity. The betrayed person loses not only trust, but self-definition. Who am I, if what I believed was a lie? The answer, terrifying and liberating, is someone new. Betrayal strips the psyche of borrowed meaning. It is initiation by fire, burning away projections until only truth remains. But the Shadow's ritual does not stop at individuals. Entire societies participate in collective betrayals. Revolutions that devour their leaders, institutions that turn on their founders, faiths that condemn their prophets. History itself is the story of ideals betrayed by their own success. Jung called this the enantiodromia of civilizations. Every principle, when carried to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. Justice becomes tyranny. Freedom becomes chaos. Love becomes control. The unconscious balances the world by inversion, and humanity experiences it as treachery. The ancients turned this mystery into ceremony. In Aztec ritual, the chosen king was celebrated as a living god, fed, worshipped, adorned, then sacrificed at the peak of his glory. The act was not cruelty, but cosmic necessity. By dying, he renewed the sun. In the mystery schools of Greece, initiates reenacted betrayal as symbolic death before spiritual rebirth. Even Christ's crucifixion follows the same pattern. Divine betrayal as passage into transformation. The psyche repeats what the cosmos performs, the shedding of form to release energy. Jung saw this pattern in dreams. A trusted figure turns hostile. A beloved symbol decays. To resist the betrayal is to stagnate. To endure it consciously is to evolve. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. Betrayal makes the darkness visible. It tears away the polite illusions that shield the ego from truth. The pain of it is not punishment, but purification. Still, the modern world recoils from this sacred logic. We have sanitized suffering, pathologized loss, and moralized pain. We forget that the unconscious speaks in destruction because creation has no other language. Neuroscience tells us that heartbreak reshapes the brain's reward pathways, forcing new connections where old ones died. The same neural plasticity that causes agony enables transformation. Pain is architecture. Betrayal, therefore, is not the end of love. It is its transmutation from dependence to awareness. The ritual unfolds in 3 stages. First comes blindness, the trance of devotion, where you see only what you wish to see. Then comes rupture, the revelation that your ideal was an illusion. Finally comes reconstitution, the birth of a self that no longer seeks salvation outside. Each stage mirrors the alchemical sequence. Negredo, albedo, rubedo, blackening, whitening, reddening. Death, purification, rebirth. The betrayal is the crucible in which the soul distills authenticity, but not all survive the fire. Some cling to bitterness, freezing the ritual midway. They worship their wound, mistaking suffering for meaning. Others repeat the cycle endlessly, seeking new saviors to betray them again. Jung warned that, without awareness, the psyche will recreate the same drama with new actors. What you do not make conscious, he wrote, appears in your life as fate. But to escape the pattern, you must bow before it, not as victim, but as witness. The antidote is not forgiveness alone, but comprehension. Forgiveness without understanding is amnesia. Understanding without forgiveness is pride. True liberation requires both, to see the necessity of the wound and to release its power. The betrayer is not your destroyer, but your teacher, the dark priest of transformation. They have carried the archetype of destruction so you could awaken. When you can thank them, not for what they did, but for what you became because of it, the ritual completes. In the end, betrayal reveals a truth older than morality, that every bond is temporary, every illusion mortal, and every death a door. The shadow does not punish, it initiates, it forces you to discover the only loyalty that cannot be broken, the one between you and your own consciousness. So when you are betrayed, do not rush to curse the betrayer. Sit with the fire. Let it consume the false. Let it burn the masks, the stories, the need to be seen as innocent. When the ashes settle, you will find something indestructible, the soul that no longer fears loss. That is the secret Jung never said aloud, that betrayal is not the fall of love, but its final revelation. For only when the mirror breaks can you see who was truly standing there all along. There comes a moment when the outer world collapses, when no ideology, relationship, or belief can explain what you have become. The betrayal has done its work, the illusions have died, and you are left staring at the ruins of your own mind. This is the threshold of awakening. It is not gentle. It is the moment when consciousness turns upon itself and becomes both witness and judge. Jung described it as standing before the tribunal of the self, a judgment not imposed from outside, but emerging from within, as if the soul had decided to weigh its own worth. At first, it feels like madness. The categories of good and evil dissolve. Every justification that once made sense now rings hollow. You begin to see that every act of cruelty was once an act of protection. Every act of love contained a trace of possession. The polarity collapses. The mind searches for a verdict, but finds only mirrors. This is the hour of psychic nakedness, the dark noon of the soul. No deity, no doctrine, no friend can stand beside you here. Jung called it the encounter with the self, the moment the ego realizes it was never in control. Neuroscience calls this state metacognition, the mind observing its own thoughts. Yet the language of science cannot capture the terror of this awareness. It is not analysis, but revelation. Consciousness, realizing that it has built its world out of projection, desire, and fear. The observer and the observed collapse into one. You see yourself committing every sin you condemned, loving every enemy you despised, wearing every mask you tore from others. The moral architecture crumbles, leaving only truth, the unbearable unity of opposites. Jung illustrated this through the symbol of Christ on the cross, the divine nailed between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, light and dark. To awaken is to hang there, crucified by contradiction. The conscious mind screams for resolution, but the self demands integration. You cannot escape the opposites. You must endure them until they reveal their common root. Only then does consciousness expand beyond judgment into awareness. That expansion is not peace. It is clarity, sharp as ice, merciless as light. At this stage, many retreat into denial. The old illusions call seductively. Religion promising absolution, ideology promising certainty, relationships promising distraction. But those who answer the call of the unconscious cannot return. Once the eye has opened inward, it cannot close. Jung compared this to the mythical serpent swallowing its own tail, the Ouroboros of total awareness. The soul becomes both devourer and devoured, dissolving the separation between creation and destruction. Modern psychology glimpses this process in trauma recovery. Survivors who transcend victimhood often report a paradoxical calm, a sense that nothing external can truly harm them anymore. Their awareness no longer clings to narrative, it observes. The neural pathways of fear lose dominance, replaced by networks of introspection and regulation. Biologically, this is integration. Spiritually, it is rebirth. The brain rewires itself for truth. In mythic terms, this is the resurrection phase. Not the bliss of heaven, but the stillness after death. The alchemists called it rubedo, the reddening, when the opposites fuse into the philosopher's stone. The awakened individual no longer divides the world into victim and villain, sacred and profane. They see that everything serves consciousness. Even darkness becomes holy when understood as part of the whole. Jung wrote, "One does not become good by denying the shadow, but by bringing it into relation with the light. This is the essence of moral evolution. Not purity, but wholeness. But awakening has a cost. Once consciousness becomes its own judge, external authority loses power. You cannot be controlled by fear of hell, nor seduced by promises of paradise. You belong to no ideology, no cult, no tribe. To the sleeping world, this freedom looks like heresy. To the awakened, it feels like solitude. You begin to understand why prophets walked alone, why mystics spoke in riddles, why truth is often met with hostility. The collective, bound by its illusions, resents those who break the spell. Ancient texts knew this trial well. The Buddha faced Mara's illusions under the tree. Christ faced temptation in the desert. Socrates faced the poison of Athens. Each symbol represents the same ordeal. The individual standing before the judgment of truth, refusing to flee into comfort. Awakening is not enlightenment as fantasy sells it. It is confrontation with the real, stripped of anesthesia. It is not light without shadow, but light that no longer fears shadow. In this awareness, love changes shape. It is no longer attachment or desire, but recognition. You see yourself in others not as reflection, but as continuation. Compassion becomes the natural state, not because you have become saintly, but because separation no longer makes sense. Every cruelty wounds you. Every kindness heals you. This is not morality, as it is physics of the soul. Still, the awakened remain human. They feel anger, fear, and sorrow, but they no longer identify with them. Emotions pass through like weather across the vast sky. The difference lies not in purity, but in perspective. Awareness has expanded beyond the storm. Jung compared this to standing at the center of a mandala, chaos spinning around, yet the observer unmoved. Science might describe this as heightened integration between the default mode network and the limbic system, enabling balanced self-regulation. But beneath the jargon, the mystery remains. The mind, aware of itself, becomes both creator and witness of reality. The universe, seen through awakened eyes, is no longer hostile or random. It is participatory, alive, responsive. The dreamer knows he is dreaming, and thus begins to dream responsibly. The awakening transforms judgment into discernment. The former condemns, the latter understands. The former divides, the latter integrates. Consciousness that judges without awareness becomes tyranny. Consciousness that observes without judgment becomes wisdom. This is the evolution Jung foresaw. Humanity moving from belief to direct experience, from obedience to awareness. But beware, enlightenment is not an escape from darkness. It is its crown. To awaken is to carry the whole of human contradiction without breaking, to look into the eyes of evil and still see the possibility of redemption. Those who can do this are not saints, but mirrors of reality itself. They are the living synthesis of creation, capable of both laughter and mourning in the same breath. And so, when consciousness becomes its own judge, the world ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a reflection. Every conflict is a dialogue between fragments of the same mind. The task is no longer to win, but to understand. For in the end, awakening is not an ascent. It is a return. The self remembering it was never divided, never fallen, only dreaming. The universe awakens through you, one perception at a time. In the end, every journey through darkness leads to the same mirror. It waits quietly, long after the noise of revelation has faded, after every betrayal has burned its truth into you, after the gods of illusion have died by your own hand. There, in the stillness, you stand alone before the last reflection. The mirror no longer lies, because it no longer flatters. It shows not the face you wanted to become, but the being you have always been. Vast, terrible, luminous, incomplete. Jung called this moment the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, the alchemical marriage of light and shadow within the self. It is the end of seeking and the beginning of being. The final lesson of the shadow is that there was never an enemy. Every adversary, every wound, every ghost that haunted you was a mask of your own unintegrated soul. What you called evil was unlived potential. What you called betrayal was transformation in disguise. The unconscious never punished you. It educated you through symbols too painful to ignore. And now, as you stare into that last reflection, you see that even suffering had meaning, not as cosmic justice, but as the language of evolution. Consciousness expands not through comfort, but through confrontation with its own limits. The mirror whispers truths that no religion dares to print. There is no savior coming. There is no final judgment but your own awareness. Heaven and hell were metaphors for inner states. Salvation was never escape. It was integration. The soul's purpose is not purity but wholeness, to contain every contradiction without collapse, to forgive and to condemn, to create and to destroy, to love and to fear all at once without denial. Only then does the human become divine, not by rising above its nature, but by embracing it fully. Neuroscience, in its cautious language, speaks of coherence, the synchronization of disparate brain networks into harmonious function. Mystics call it enlightenment. Jung called it individuation. Across disciplines, the pattern is identical, integration after fragmentation. When the mind ceases to fight itself, perception clears. The outer world loses its power to wound, for it is recognized as reflection. You no longer react, you respond. You no longer seek, you see. This is the threshold where fear dissolves, not because danger has vanished, but because the self no longer demands certainty. The awakened soul understands that chaos is not the opposite of order, but its foundation. The abyss that once terrified you now feels familiar. It breathes with you, speaks through you. The monsters you fled have become allies. The darkness that threatened to devour you has become your source of strength. What was once the enemy now guards your wisdom. This is the paradox of transformation, that only by dying into the shadow do you discover eternal life within awareness. Myth has always encoded this return. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero seeks immortality, only to find it in acceptance of mortality. In the alchemical texts, the material is refined through endless dissolution until it reveals its golden core. In the Gospels, resurrection follows descent into hell. Jung saw all these as psychic maps of the same process. The ego's death leading to the birth of the self. The shadow's final lesson is not destruction, but completion. Yet completion does not mean closure. The mirror remains, reflecting infinite depth. Awakening is not an endpoint, but an ongoing dialogue between known and unknown. The unconscious never ceases to whisper, for creation is unfinished by design. Consciousness must keep evolving, questioning, integrating. The moment you believe yourself finished, the shadow returns, disguised as certainty. Evolution demands humility, the awareness that even clarity must die to make room for greater light. The collective, still trapped in its dreams, will not understand this peace. They will call it detachment, madness, even apathy, but you will know better. You will walk through the world aware that every person is a fragment of the same mirror, every conflict a rehearsal for understanding, every loss a ritual of renewal. Compassion becomes inevitable, not sentimental but lucid. You no longer pity the sleeping. You simply see them as earlier versions of yourself, still wrestling with the first reflection. Spiritual traditions often end their scriptures with praise or promise, but Jung's psychology ends with silence, the kind that follows realization. For what remains to be said once the opposites are reconciled? When love and death are recognized as twin currents of the same river, words collapse under the weight of their own insufficiency. What remains is awareness, vast and still, watching the dance of existence with neither attachment nor aversion. And yet, even here, the shadow remains, not as threat, but as reminder. It watches you as you once watched it, ensuring balance, ensuring humility. For if the light forgets its source in darkness, the cycle must begin again. That is the eternal rhythm of the psyche. Creation, projection, confrontation, integration, and rebirth. The mirror shatters and reforms endlessly, each fragment carrying the memory of the whole. Perhaps that is the final truth Jung tried to leave behind, that consciousness itself is the universe dreaming of its own reflection. Every thought, every betrayal, every act of grace is part of that dream. And though the dream may darken, though it may turn violent and strange, it never ceases to serve the awakening of awareness. The shadow is not your enemy, but your oldest teacher, patient, relentless, merciful in its cruelty. So look once more into the mirror. See the line between you and the world dissolve. Feel the pulse of existence as your own heartbeat. And when the reflection finally smiles back, you will understand there was never light without shadow, never life without death, never God without the abyss. The shadow's final lesson is this, that you were never two. You were always one, learning to see itself in the dark.